Too often women feel as though they are stuck. They've been told to sit down, be quiet and play small. Join us as three amazing women from very different walks of life. Janice McRandle, Nidhi Nadaraja and Brooke Prentice talk about what it means for them to be making progress rather than be stuck in the precedents of the past. So welcome everybody to, this is the first of a series of panels discussions that I'm going to have around the theme of progress, not precedent. And I am so pleased to have as part of our panel today, I have Brooke Prentice and Nidhi Nadaraja and Janice McRandle. Welcome to the three of you. It's just wonderful to have you here. I'm just to introduce our panellists. So Brooke Prentice is a Waka Waka woman and an Aboriginal Christian leader. She's a chartered accountant. My goodness, she can tick so many things off. A chartered accountant, company director, coordinator of the Grass Tree Gathering, which I have been to, which is absolutely fabulous, and the former CEO of Common Grace, which is a not-for-profit movement of over 50,000 people pursuing justice. Brooke is a much sought-after speaker and writer, an educator, and even a poet. Good, join the club. Poetry is great. Brooke consults to companies, assisting with the development of reconciliation action plans and conducts workshops on cultural, sorry, I've lost my place, on cultural awareness and cultural safety. Brooke has appeared on national and international television, radio and podcasts, including the ABC's The Drum, NITV's The Point, ABC RN Soul Search and US Christianity Today. Brooke is currently writing a book, which will be published in the next 12 months to assist non-Indigenous Australians to engage, build and deepen relationships with Aboriginal peoples, Aboriginal justice, including reconciliation. So thank you so much, Brooke, for being with us here today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I was just thinking we've come a long way from when I met you a few years ago. We've both our journeys have changed quite a bit. And then there's Nidhi Nadaraja. Now, this is my first time of actually talking with Nidhi. We've been connected on LinkedIn for a couple of years now, and when the idea of this panel came up, she was probably right towards the top of my list of people I wanted on the panel. So Nidhi is a senior lawyer based in Melbourne and has a passion for authentic and inclusive leadership. She believes that we are human first and that the titles we hold don't define us. Until very recently, Nidhi was working at a large corporate, but has decided, yay girl, to just try her hand at entrepreneurship instead. She advocates for a range of issues such as gender and racial equality, supporting NFPs operating in that space, and volunteers as a peer support champion for the Pink Elephant Support Network, an organisation that supports women who have experienced early pregnancy loss. And that's wonderful, Nidhi, because I think there's so many of us who have experienced early pregnancy loss. And so, yeah, that sort of support is just wonderful. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And then finally, Janice McRandle. Now, Janice, gosh, what's it, 12 years or something that we met. I was a lowly cadet in the Salvation Army and Janice was the officer at the Corps, where I went and did some training. And again, like with Brooke, our paths have gone quite different directions to where they were at that stage. But Janice, now Dr. Janice McRandle, is a feminist, yeah, that's a good thing, a feminist theologian who works with critical theory to explore themes of systematic theology alongside politics and popular culture. Having worked in theological education for over a decade, Janice brings a wealth of experience in research and leadership. Along with her academic writing and research supervision, Janice provides oversight for the cooperative developing a space for a broad and interdisciplinary public theology through the cooperatives programs and research streams. And I had the privilege of being able to write something for the cooperative last year about my reflections on my time on Nauru and how that impacts our policy with asylum seekers. So welcome, Janice.
Thank you, Bron, and thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. Now, I'm really anticipating that this panel is going to be quite lively. We're all quite diverse. And so what we're going to do is just kick off. I had publicised that we have 3 questions that we want to talk about. And then we have had another one from Emily. Thank you, Emily. She's here with us and she's coming in from the US. So lovely to have you, Emily. And she's sent us a question in which I think is a really good one. Hi, Emily. Lovely to have you. And we will we'll get to that question towards the end. So I'm going to start off. I'll get all the panelists to answer, but I'll take this one. I'm going to take it to Janice first. What does tangible and meaningful progress look like?
Yeah, I think that obviously as a theorist of some sort, I'm always going to say context is the most crucial key here. And what that looks like will always be determined by the community of people that gather around the question. And so I think, you know, the temptation and one of the failures of Western liberal democracy is to try to transplant and migrate the same kind of progress all over the world, which has often been a really violent project and gets to the root of colonialism and the Atlantic slave trade and the kind of horrors of the last 500 years of thinking progress in itself is a good thing or that it can happen in universal ways. So my first response to that question is progress looks contextual and it's a grassroots movement to riff off the title of a group that Brooke leads so well. So progress is contextual, it's a grassroots movement, and it's a negotiable category that is always being reflected on and engaged with critically, so that, you know, if progress is to be a good, right? Like, because the problem of the last 100 years is what we discovered is what we thought was progress was actually a horror of the most violent century in history. So if progress is to be good, if there's something to be good about that, then it has to start from the grassroots up. It has to be radically contextual and it has to be constantly reevaluated and analysed and assessed for who is this progress benefiting the most, and is it leading to greater justice and equity, or the same kind of power dynamics that continue to oppress?
Good. Thank you, Janice. I'll throw it to Brooke now, given that Janice mentioned you. So what can you add to that? Because I'm sure you can.
Yeah, thank you. And that was a really great answer, Janice, so thank you. I guess what comes to front of mind, and probably coming off the back of what Janice has just said, is this concept of progress. And, you know, as we look at the global colonial project, I'm particularly, these images come to mind, one which is on the Capitol building in the lands now known as the United States of America, which is the progress of civilization, and that's replicated in Meanjin in Brisbane on Brisbane City Town Hall. And on each of those, in the United States of America, you have Native Americans dying out at one end to then progress civilization, and in the one on in Meanjin on Brisbane's City Hall, you have the Aboriginal people dying out, and that's progress. And I guess when we take it to this conversation that we're talking about today, you really have to analyse the systems that have been built. And I don't think real change can come unless we dismantle all of those systems. Here in these lands now called Australia, that system has been in place for 250 years. And, you know, I think that system has created in its evolution. Sometimes I feel like we're still stuck at the same place, even though you see this change, it's not systemic change. And that's really what's needed to actually get proper progress.
Yeah. Thanks, Brooke. Neeti, you would understand, being a lawyer, you would have worked with and work with many systems. Where do you see what Brooke's saying about systemic change? What have you seen happen in terms of progress? What do you think needs to happen?
It's a good question. I mean, I think Brooke and Janice are both correct. You know, I mean, progress is contextual. Progress depends on the subject, right, of you know, of what you're considering progress to be. And I think when it comes to systems, I think a lot of them are so entrenched in society, in our workplaces, in our family structures, in our cultural societies and communities, that there is a lot that needs to be dismantled in order to really have tangible progress versus, I think, just, you know, people speaking about moving the needle, which I think unfortunately is what happens more often than not. And, you know, we're still speaking about things that we've been speaking about, you know, in the gender space or in the race space for decades. You know, things haven't really changed that much as far as the actual underlying structures are concerned. And I think, you know, so what will it take to achieve real progress and to dismantle these systems? I think it takes a whole lot of courage. And it takes real action. Like, it actually takes people going, do you know what, I'm going to challenge the status quo. I'm going to challenge my own thinking around why this is the way it is and why I believe that this is the only way things can be. And I see that particularly, for example, in my own profession, you know, having gone through private practice initially, you know, very traditional structures, nothing's changed over the years, and yet there's a lot of talk about, you know, equity and inclusion within these places, but unless you really unpack the model that sits behind these organizations and relook at that entire model, it's unlikely that they're ever going to achieve monumental progress, right? Like, perhaps they might have some incremental things that happen along the way and things might improve to a certain degree, but I don't think they're ever going to move the needle very far unless they look at those systems. And I think the same is true in society more broadly.
Thanks, Nadia. I wanted to pick up on that one when you talked about challenging our own thinking, because we are the structures, like you talked about the structures and systems. When we use those words, we often think of big systems and structures like corporations and governments. But as you said, we have systems and structures in our own families that are entrenched, and any of us, including myself, who's ever broken a family system or gone against a family system or structure, we know how deeply entrenched those structures are, you know, and I see in them the biases that fuel how we think what is right, what is wrong, what is normal, and those things have to be challenged. But I also like, and Carolyn, thank you for putting this in the chat. And please, if you're just listening to us, please feel free to use the chat to put in some comments, because that will help guide our conversation as well. Because Carolyn has said you can't change a paradigm using the models of that same paradigm. And that's so true. And I think that is why I have been, why this discussion is about progress, not precedent, because precedent keeps us stuck. Like, you know, Neeti, you understand that from the law perspective, precedent is almost like God in the law, where, you know, you go back to a precedent to be able to prove a point or to ask for justice in a particular area, but can also keep us stuck. So it is a paradigm, as Carolyn said, that keeps us in place. And one of the questions that which I put out there and thought it was ironic, given that we're going to be talking, like our second question, which I think we'll probably go around. I was going to say go around in circles, but I think we will go backwards and forwards. So even though I might move to the second question, you know, I think we'll be coming backwards and forwards between the three. Because the second question says, why is conversation only insufficient? And you know, the irony of that was not lost on me when I'm putting together a panel discussion. So I suppose that maybe I could frame that question, and I'll go to Brooke first, because, you know, I know she's been in a place of actively trying to change things, and I know Janice does as well. But just why isn't conversation enough? And how can we move? Like, you know, we talked about shifting the needle. How do we do that? How do we move from conversation, which is important because ideas are important, but how do we shift from there to some actual action? Brooke.
Yeah, so this is quite an interesting question, because in my context as Aboriginal person and Indigenous person from these lands now called Australia, we're still up against what W.E.H. Danner, white male anthropologist, in his 1968 Boyer lectures termed the Great Australian Silence. And he talked about that Australia suffers a cult of forgetfulness practiced on a national scale. And so in much of my context, it has been the need to start the conversation, that the conversation isn't even happening. And so I think as we think about context and systems, and Aboriginal peoples of these lands now called Australia being the world's oldest living continuing cultures, there's so much to learn from that. But today we were once 100% of the Australian population. Today, as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, Indigenous peoples of Australia, we're only 3% of the conversation. So sometimes of the population. So sometimes that conversation, it's not relevant. Australia is currently in the throes of leading up to a federal election. And how much Aboriginal people spoken about, spoken to, where our voices heard. And it's not that we have been silent, but there's this phenomenon that exists that we aren't listened to. Now that's changed, I think, over the last 5 years, and people are talking about wanting to listen to Aboriginal peoples. Great, but we're stuck at the conversation. So my work has been moving from the listening to the learning and the loving. And for me, the loving is putting the actions in place and actually taking action. My fear is that Australia, with its relationship with Aboriginal peoples, will stay stuck at the conversation. And so I think as we look at, so I'm talking about a national and even a global situation that we have. This is a global colonial project that's still in place today. But as we look to our corporations, yes, these conversations might be taking place. We look at Australian media, you know, last year for NAIDOC Week, Channel 10 has the weather map of Australia with the capital cities in their original Aboriginal names, but it's only for NAIDOC Week. And so it's still this conversation, and we're really just still only starting that in Australia and so many aspects of our society. And so I guess it's, you know, as 3% of the population, it's, you know, I'm still talking to so many Australians that think Black Lives Matter started in 2020 and started here in Australia with the death of George Floyd. And these are often our younger people who have well researched this, and they think that's when it started. And it's like, no. Like, I wrote an article about Aboriginal people being in solidarity with African Americans back in 2016 through our Aboriginal deaths in custody. And so, you know, the answers are there, but I think what I've had to realise is that the 97% of the rest of Australia, and that's not just white Australians, and I think often that's where the conversation in Australia can get stuck, but we need our people of all different cultures that now represent Australia to come and stand beside us and actually bring the change that's necessary. And that's the other thing that often happens. whatever I say is filled with action, but often non-Indigenous and particularly white Australians can't hear the action. And I think that's still their bias coming through to not wanting to, the racism that exists, that actually we don't have anything to learn from Aboriginal peoples. But I'll listen and I'll be in relationship. But relationship to us means community and sharing of resources, being wholeness of community.
Can I just ask you to expand on something there, Brooke, because as a white Australian who has, well, I feel come late to the game in that I was in my 50s before I figured out that I was racist and that I have white privilege, and I better figure, oh, better late than never. So I just see myself as someone who is continually learning and recognise that I'm a product of my environment and of my upbringing, but that doesn't mean I have to stay that way. You talked about white Australians can't hear the action. Can you expand on that? Because I love that, being a person of words and the juxtaposition of words, I know that that is quite intentional, that you put those two together. So please expand on that a bit.
Yeah, it's a little bit tied up with the concept of hope. So when most white Australians come to a session with me, they want to listen, but then they hear all of these, to them, what would be sad stories of injustice, of poverty that face Aboriginal peoples. They can't hear that there's actually a story of strength, resilience, adaptability. And I actually give practical actions, but because they just want to hear the hope, because it's still about feeling good and I want to do something that will make me feel good instead of something that actually brings systemic change for the betterment of society that has justice and equality. And it was actually an African-American lady who'd been brought out as a guest speaker at a conference that pointed this out to me, because I had this white Australian man at the end of this 3-hour seminar who said, yes, but what can I do? And she like turned around and said, Brooke's just given you 50 things to do. And she had to tackle it down as actually racism. You don't actually want to hear. And so that was an eye-opener for me.
Oh, look, that's excellent. I like that racism, in a sense, is about not wanting to hear. That's, yeah, because what we hear, we don't like, and so we want to push it away. Now, I'm going to go to Janice because I want to ask, because I know that she is taking action in many ways in her field, which is dominated by white males. It has been dominated by white males for millennia. So, Janice, can you talk to this whole idea of, well, why conversation is not enough? Is there sufficient conversation? And who is actually doing the talking? Because someone put in the chat, are we only just having conversations because it's only women doing the talking?
Yeah, I guess the first thought on the question of conversation and action is that I think it's always a dialectical process. So both of those things always have to be in play. And there's the temptation on one hand, obviously I teach more critical theory or radical philosophy. So a lot of the students that I encounter or people that engage through research want to be on the right side of history. They want to be a progressive voice. They want to think the right things. So there's a real temptation, especially in this moment of being afraid of being called out. People just want to say the right thing. And there's a kind of, I just don't want to be publicly shamed. I just want to have the right thing to say, which is it's a self-absorbed project, and it's not concerned about justice very much other than one's reputation. So there's a temptation at that end, but there's also a temptation on the other end. I just want to do a thing. When, as Brooke said, we're just getting started thinking about some of this stuff and analysing it and unravelling it. And I think there's a kind of white Western impulse to, no, we need action, we need outcomes, we need measurables. And I don't want to spend years thinking about this. Just give me the 3 takeaways and then tell me that. So both of those things are a danger. And both of those impulses to stay in either of those spaces don't create a lot of creative tension. So, of course, yes, there are communities that are involved in conversations that are going nowhere. But there are other communities that are resisting the urge to be productivity driven. They're resisting the urge for you to think they're impressive. They're resisting the urge to get everything done in the first 12 months. And they're really taking their time building a community that works well together and starting to think deeply and in new ways about these things. So, the comment was made earlier, reminiscent of the Audre Lorde quote, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." You don't build a new toolkit overnight. That takes time, it takes community, it takes a lot of effort and creative tension. So we have to be willing to give both of those negotiations time.
Yeah, I like that, Janice, because probably there's a few of us who have been around the sun a number of decades. The hair is grey, and so and that was one of the things I found really interesting at turning 60, to be able to, I now had a significant number of decades under my belt to be able to look back. And, I was born in the mid-1950s, and I look at where women were. I look at where Indigenous people were. Well, Indigenous people were just interesting people that I learned about in my social studies when I was at school. We talked about pickaninnies, and so that was where I started. And then I look to where we've got to now, and it's not as far as we want to be. It's not as far as we need to be, but I can see change. And so I think that's the balance, isn't it, between wanting to know that we need structural change, like Needy was talking about earlier, but knowing that actually takes time, because the structures, whether that's family structures, corporate structures, racial structures, whatever they are, have taken sometimes millennia, at the very least generations, to build and be implemented and to work out of. And we're just starting, in a sense, we're really starting to gain some momentum now. So it's about, keeping on moving.
Yeah, and if I just now flip entirely and give a very pragmatic answer to your question. So I think, there's deep concerns there. But the other thing I would say in my field, in academia, working with sometimes institutions that saying, we want to change and we don't want our reading list to be all white men and we don't want to, is one thing I've learned also, which is to temper everything else I've just said, is that there has to be policies in place. If you good intentions and all the conversations around, the group blue sky dreaming or whatever, you almost always go nowhere. And things like quotas, when we abandoned them over the last 20 years, places have gone backwards. So, for example, in the boardroom in Australia, we abandoned quotas, and women's representation in boardrooms in Australia has plummeted over the last 10 years. So the very pragmatic answer is there have to be policies and people have to be accountable to them.
Yeah. Needy, can you take us somewhere from what Janice has just said, knowing that you've worked in spaces where there's, bean boards and huge structures, of which you would have, as a woman and also as a woman of colour, you would have been definitely in a minority group?
Yeah, it's interesting. Before I go to the board question, actually, just coming back to the question around conversation, one of the things I think that's a really big problem, and this sort of picks up on something that both Brooke and Janice said, is that often we talk at people rather than talking with people. And I think, this is part of the problem, and it goes to the, problem-solving mode that often people are in, that, it's, okay, well, this is what we need to do. And so therefore there's a solution that's put forward, but is that solution something that's actually being arrived at in conjunction with other people? And I think that's where often, that sort of real deep listening doesn't really take place. And I see this, even in workplaces quite frequently, there's a lot of chatter, and we saw it with Black Lives Matter, and all of a sudden all the, big corporates around the world were, starting to talk about race, and, 2 years down the track, are they still talking about it? And this is part of the problem. You talk and you talk and you talk, but often it's just sharing stories and or really big solutions. And I think sometimes this is the other thing too, coming back to the point around, you know, how long change might take. Sometimes the small things are just as important as the really big things. And I saw this, you know, just working in sort of inclusion and diversity committees at work, you know, often it was people wanted to tackle the big issue, right? And I'm like, let's break this down, you know, let's break this down into 10 little issues and take one of those issues and address that one issue properly, right? And then we might see some actual tangible change rather than if you try and address the big elephant, you know. And I think often, for me, I think that's the thing that people often don't focus on. And it's interesting, I was reflecting the other day, and I was reflecting on this as we were speaking, just, you know, my daughter's 8 and she's at primary school, and just little things like the fact that they're houses, like, you know, that they're organized into, for those who aren't in Australia, so different groupings. Yeah, you've got houses too. Okay. So they, you know, in my time had very Anglo-Saxon names, right? Whereas the houses that my daughter's school has are all, you know, Indigenous names. Now that's a very, very, very small thing, but if you take these little things and you multiply them by 100, 200, 1,000, that's how we start seeing a little bit of change. And I see it even with the way they learn nowadays. It's a little bit different to the way we used to learn about Australian history. It's got a very different focus to it. So I think there is some change. It's very slow, and that can be incredibly frustrating. And I think with women in boardrooms and stuff, that's excruciatingly frustrating. I mean, I remember being at my law school on my first day, and the dean got up and said, this is the first year we've had more female, you know, intake of students versus male. And yet, you know, when we look at that intake now, it's not represented in the, you know, upper echelons of the profession, right? It's just people leave. And this comes back to the systems that are in place that don't facilitate the progress of women through these organizations. And you apply an intersectional lens onto that, and it becomes even more complex, right? And so, yeah, you have to look at these systems, and you have to really challenge the thinking, but that involves deep listening. It involves having the humility to step back and go, I don't know the answer, you know? So let's not start with the answer. Let's actually start with really deeply understanding what the problem is and where the barriers are to change.
That's great, Needy, because I think we can make an assumption that we know what the problem is. And because we know what the problem is, therefore we have the solution. And I know I've just flick back here through the comments, because somebody made a comment about we make an assumption that there actually is a solution. And was that you, Carolyn? Thank you. And I think that's a good thing too, that perhaps it's not about finding one particular solution. It's, as you say, it's about deep listening and making the little changes. And I just wanted to ask Brooke a question about the language that she has been using that I have not heard before, and I want to know whether it's language that I need to take on board, because you talk, Brooke, about the lands that we now call Australia. Is that how you phrased it?
These lands now called Australia.
These lands now called Australia. Now, is that appropriate for me as a white person to say that?
Absolutely. It's, for me, it's part of truth telling. It is a phrase I've developed, and many people are using it now. And it's often good to, you know, if people haven't heard it, don't claim it as your own. Give recognition to one Aboriginal woman. But also I'm very happy that it's being used. And, you know, also I referenced the lands now called the United States of America. Yeah. And the reason it's these in terms of a plural is because here in these lands now called Australia, there's over 300 nations of Aboriginal peoples. In the United States of America and also Canada, that's collectively Turtle Island, and that border between the Canada and the US splits Aboriginal, First Nations, Indigenous nations in half, and people separated across that line. Same with our state and territory borders here in these lands now called Australia. And so by these, it's referring to the multiple nations, and now called, because Aboriginal people, we would rather talk about our nations as Waka Waka Nation. Today I'm on Wurundjeri country. And, you know, that's how we would love all Australians and the world to see this place. It's only been, well, you could say the last 250 years, but you could go since Federation in 1901 about this concept of Australia. It hasn't always existed. And for thousands of years, there was a whole other system in place that still operates today.
Yeah. Thanks, Brooke. And yeah, and I usually do an acknowledgement of country, and I didn't today. And so my apologies, because I too am on Wurundjeri land here. And I think that for me has been one of the, you know, I have to be honest, there's still so much for me to learn, so much for me to get my head around, because I grew up in a time where it was all just white, it was what white people did, you know. Going back to Needy, you know, I was in Solander, and there was Banks and something else were our houses. You know, these were all explorers, whitest explorers who came to Australia. You know, these were the people that we were championing with our children, and that there's a sense of identification. So I'm glad that we are making incremental shifts. Now, I'm just looking at our time, because our conversation is really good. So I'm just going to jump to Emily's question, because I think she brought out some good ones, and I want to be able to, in the last 20 minutes, give some good thought to that. And if we've got time, we'll go back to the third one, because what I think Emily's bringing something different to the conversation. So thank you very much. So I'll read out what she wrote. She said, studies have shown that all racial and ethnic groups have an unconscious bias towards their own group. And I would, you know, would have been my observation too. And then the question was, how can we move away from the term race and towards ethnicity? If the term race is a social construct, then it can only be socially reconstructed, or maybe deconstructed. Race was conceived over 100 years ago, and I think it's probably a little bit longer than that, when global travel, intergroup relationships and education was much lower than it is now. Ethnicity or ancestry seems a better term moving forward, because it accounts for all groups. And she's given some examples. So instead of saying you're of the Asian race, of saying an ethnicity of East Asia, Southeast Asia, South or West Asia, rather than white, having an ethnicity of Western, Northern or Eastern European or Arabic, or a black ethnicity being, you know, West, Central East or Pan-African. I just thought it was an interesting question, because it started asking us to look at a broader picture. And I'm going to throw to Brooke on this one, and then I'm going to go to Needy, and then I'll come back to Janice. So what are your thoughts about that? Do we need to move away from the term race towards ethnicity? Is that a helpful shift, or are we just going to, in our hope for progress, we're just going to drag our precedents with us and go back to our biased ways, you know, just take our biases with us?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, I guess, for me and my context, and the context of these lands now called Australia, and the racism that exists here. Ethnicity or ethnic has been used racistly. And so I think, and you know, what Black Lives Matter has done, unfortunately, I think, is a lot of Australians are taking their academic work on race from the United States of America, but it's often African American, and the United States forgets its own Indigenous story that still exists today as well. And there's some that are relatable to here in Australia, but there's also a lot of differences. And so yes, I think it's an interesting conversation to have, and how we refer to people, how people identify with their cultural heritage. You know, in the US, you've had all these people doing DNA testing and finding out probably what their cultural backgrounds, ethnicity, races are. Some Australians are starting to do that, but the other thing is what's happened in Australia is, like, you're supposed to have this Australian identity, and so you have to put down any cultural background that you have. And I think that's particularly what Aboriginal peoples are trying to bring to our non-white cultures of peoples here in these lands now called Australia, or even white cultures that have come from other places, or what is whiteness, I guess. Anyway, I once had a conversation with an 80-year-old Greek woman who came to one of my seminars, and she said, you know, I'm not Greek, I'm Australian, but I suffer this racism of being called Greek. And I said, no, I want you to proudly say that you're Greek. And I asked her about what food she cooks, and she just came alive. But all of her life here in these lands now called Australia, she's had to struggle with that identity. And, you know, that goes to the colonial history of Australia. And if you're not in, you're out. And when it comes to Aboriginal peoples, Australia still gets to decide when we're in and when we're out. But for thousands of years, we've been here, and that still hasn't, I think, been fully accepted.
Yeah. Needy, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and a really complex question. And I think just touching on what Brooke just said just now about identity, it does get really complicated to, you know, even articulate what your ethnic background, cultural heritage, whatever term you want to use, what it is. And, you know, and with globalization, and with people moving and people marrying people who are not from the same background as themselves as well, and then having children, it becomes even more complex. So, you know, my kids, for example, will have grown up here their entire lives, most likely, but then they have some Sri Lankan in them, they have some Indian in them, they have some Malaysian Indian in them, somewhere down my husband's line there's some Australian as well, you know, so it's complex. So when they describe their ethnicity, it becomes hard to put a label on it, because what is that ethnicity anymore? And I think this, you know, as you have more and more kids that are going to grow up with these mixed racial identities, it's not going to be easy. And I think this is where, you know, it comes down to, you know, yes, you can group people into categories of people, or you can try to, but the needs of different people within those categories are going to be different as well. And I've seen this a lot recently, because I've been connecting a lot with other women of South Asian background, right? And for me, as a child of first-generation immigrants that grew up largely in Australia, my lived experiences and my needs are very different from the needs of a woman that came here in her 20s, right, as an immigrant herself. And so, and the racism you experience is different, because then you have an intersection of accent, perhaps, right, which informs your lived experience. So it's not merely the color of your skin or the place where your ancestors once, you know, came from 100, 200, 500 years ago that matters. It's all these other intersections that you have with you, your socioeconomic background, you know, what does that look like? So I think, you know, in some ways, I think we almost need to start talking with a really intersectional lens whenever we're having these discussions, because people are complex beings, and you can't categorize the needs of, say, Black people as all being, you know, singular, for example. And I think this is a conversation that I'm seeing more and more, even amongst sort of, you know, African Americans, is the distinction between people that have immigrated to the country versus people who, you know, have gone through slavery within America. And there seems to be this, you know, disconnect between the two, for example. And I think it's the same in different countries around the world. And we're only going to see more and more and more of that. So I don't know that that's an answer. I just think it's quite complex to try and categorize people as much as we like to categorize people.
No, look, I think that comment you made there, Neeti, I don't know if this is an answer, and I think that is the crux of it. There is no one answer. There's no one solution. We are looking to make progress, but as Brooke talked about right at the beginning, we've got to make sure it's progress that is not hurtful, that is not, discriminatory, that in a sense doesn't keep us stuck in patterns of behaviour that are hurtful to everybody. Janice, what can you add at this point?
Yeah, I think that, again, just to reflect back, these are complex terms that are used in complex different ways, but I think we're very many years away from dropping the language of race. And the reason I would insist on that is because racial categories emerge to serve the ideology of white supremacy. They're not neutral. The idea of race is not like some neutral, this is where you're from. It emerges over many hundreds of years into full-blown social Darwinism that creates this category of race in which white people are at the top. And that is an ideology that continues to have enormous influence around the globe. Some might say it's having a big comeback, or was it just hidden in the politeness of the 20th century? White supremacy is an ideology that fuels the colonial project and neoliberal global expansion to this day. So these are two terms doing very different things often, and ethnicity often more important in fields of sociology, and racism in philosophy and humanities. There's lots of crossover and it is complex, but I think they're both terms that are very important to our analysis of how injustice works. And the only other final thought I would give is often when we think about, using the language of being white, again, yes, it is a social construction, but it's like the language of analysing masculinity or femininity. Anyone can be white according to this kind of thinking around racism, and whiteness is a way of being in the world. So it's a distinct category that's really important if we want to understand white supremacy.
Thank you, Janice. Yeah, I think I want to go back to a comment that Neeti made about incremental change, because when you were talking, Neeti, about the little changes that we can make, my mind went straight to the movie Hidden Numbers, or Hidden Figures. And, of course, there's this brilliant woman, A, she's a woman, and B, she's black, in this white, male-dominated office sort of space trying to get a man on the moon. And she's not allowed to use the coffee pot that everybody else is because she's black. And just, and there's just a scene where there's a simple thing where, something happens and everybody drinks out of the same coffee pot. It's those little changes that have to be made, and they have to be made at an individual level. And so in our last 10 minutes, I think that's where we'll come back to then our third question is, because we've talked about conversations and how important the conversations are, and Brooke mentioned that maybe we're not even having the conversations that we need, or we're not having enough of them, or the people who are talking aren't being listened to. So the conversation is important. And, the comment was also made that we often, particularly as white people, we just want to get things done. We want to make it happen. We want to have this solution. We want to do it now. But we've got to hold the two in balance. The fact that we still do need conversations, but we also want to bring about change. So, Brooke, how do we balance that? How do we balance making changes when we know that structures change slowly, and many of them have been in place for, millennia? How do we bring about the change that we want to see?
We just have to do something, just one thing. And, I was reflecting as I heard the conversation, like often the criticism of Aboriginal peoples is you want this big picture solution. We want the system dismantled and not just fixed. It's a whole new structure. But often when we get to that point, it's because we're frustrated because we've wanted these little incremental changes, but you haven't listened or you've dismissed it. And we're very finely tuned to understanding that. And so then we often go to the extreme, and then non-Indigenous people often go, oh, well, I can't do anything. But there is always something you can do. It's just the one thing. It's even, we talked about those houses and now having Aboriginal names. Whilst that might seem like a good thing, and so it's encouraging, it's the one thing, tick, great, excellent. But what's missing is I've been with lots of schools who've been through this process, and I've had teachers come to me and they're like, oh, we get to vote. And they've got this list of 10 Aboriginal names that they could choose, but they have no idea what the background of that name is and haven't taken the time to go and learn to work out which one do I actually want here. Oh, I've heard of this Aboriginal person, so yes, I'll vote for this one. But you've just neglected 9 others that could have taught you something. And Western cultures are so about the naming, which becomes this ownership thing. And so I'm conflicted even on that level, but at least there's one thing happening. But it's like, you can't just stop at that one thing. If you do the one thing, then you go to the next thing. And so it's like, even if you voted for that only one that you knew, well, go back and learn the other 9, and don't wait for someone to tell you what to do. You know what the right thing is. If you're going to vote in something, you should research all of those to work out which one you want to do. And we do these things in everyday activities, like in our jobs. And so when that comes to diversity and inclusion, don't change your process that you do in any other activity. Use the same process, which is about the listening, the learning, and the action. But just do the one thing.
Just do the one thing. I like it. Thanks. Yeah.
And if I could give one little other story, and that's around acknowledgement of country. And I know there's people from other nations here today, but we have this acknowledgement of country here in these lands now called Australia. And when we talk about these one things, often I get the question of, oh, but isn't that just tokenistic? And I said, yeah, but you're not doing anything. So sometimes we actually just have to start with the token, because otherwise you're not doing anything. So I don't mind if it's token, but hopefully you don't stay at the token and it progresses. But acknowledgements of country, someone did it in a meeting. And then later on in the meeting, I wasn't in this meeting, someone said something that was totally not culturally appropriate. But the question was, should we still do the acknowledgement of country because it's now token? It's like, no, that's not your question. That's not, you need to do the acknowledgement of country, but you have to call out the poor behaviour, and there has to be accountability, which is where those policies are so important. And that's often what the problem is. There's a lack of accountability, which means the cost is on us because we've often spoken up, but then there's no action or accountability. And so then it just keeps happening. So with all that said, do the one thing.
Do the one thing. And I know I've got 2 one things to do. One is to include these lands now called Australia into my language. The other is actually I learn about the Wurundjeri people. I've been living on this land for 5 or 6 years. I need to know, and I haven't done that yet. So thank you. Needy, how do we balance change and conversation?
Yeah, I think it depends on what you're talking about, right? So, we're at different places when it comes to different conversations. So if we look, for example, at, stuff that's been topical of late around, transgender people and participating in sports, like female sports in Australia, right? And the comments around that, people are still not willing to have the conversation. It's anytime that conversation is raised, there's a lot of aggro, sorry for using an Australian abbreviation, that, it just gets really heated. People don't want to listen. And people just go back to their, this is the way I believe, this is what I think, and therefore, it's my way or the highway. And so I think when it comes to something like that, the conversation is critical, right? We still need to have the conversation because people are not yet willing to engage in it fully. right? When it comes to, you know, other things, like if we're talking about racial or cultural diversity and equity, you know, we're probably at a little bit of a different place. So I think, yes, then you have to balance conversation and action, but I don't think you can have action without conversation. So you need to have them both. And I think this point was made earlier on. You have to have them both, right? But then I think, as Brooke said, it is those little things. It's the little things you can do. It's the little conversations you can have. So, you know, even starting at home, you know, so I make sure that when it comes to my daughter, my son's too young at the moment, but when it comes to my daughter, if she says something, like she came home one day and she was talking about a kid in her school who had two mums, right? We then have a conversation about that because it's important. Okay, well, let's talk about this, and what questions do you have? Equally, you know, representation is important. So, you know, I think there was a comment around, you know, the election and people of color that are running, particularly women of color that are running in the election. And that's important. You know, we need to highlight these things and make them front and center so that they become part of our awareness and our psyche. So I think, you know, and that's an action that, you know, Women's Agenda has taken to run their feed, and other organizations have taken to create these lists and curate these lists, etc. Right? So, you know, it is the little things that you need to do. And I found this particularly, you know, a couple of years ago. I just got to a point where I was like, I'm sick of just donating money, and I need to actually do something, you know. And you do. I think it is the little things, you know. And it doesn't need to be grand gestures. It doesn't need to be earth-shattering things that you do. It's that support that you can perhaps provide organizations that operate in this space to say, do you know what? For me, for example, if you need some legal advice, I'm here, you know, ask me, or I can connect you to people. And that's a way of helping them to get ahead. And from my perspective, it might seem like a very small thing. From their perspective, it's a really big thing because of the access to those type of services that these organizations might have. So sometimes it doesn't take a lot to actually help and do something to change things a little bit.
Yeah, Carolyn's made a comment that sometimes it's the little big things get under other people's skin, though. And yeah, and I certainly understand that, because our little things sometimes do annoy other people. And I think that's actually okay, because if it's annoying other people, it means it's actually hitting the spot. Okay, over to you, Janice, to bring it home.
Everything that's been said, and the only final thing I would add in terms of seeing that change happen is resist the urge to be the hero and the savior. Most things you want to see change in the world, there's already a group doing great work in that area, so go and support them. Get behind them. You don't need to be the leader. Give them your money, your time and your resources, and support what's already happening out there. That's
the great words, Janice, because they're things that I've been, in a sense, taking myself to task over, you know, because of the space that I operate in. I see conversations on LinkedIn around bias that I don't agree with, because, hello, other people think differently to me. Funny. And I have to resist the temptation of jumping on the comments and going, no, it's like this. Because the reality is, the more of us who talk about, whether it's talking about any of the things that we've talked about today, doesn't matter what we're talking about, what change we want to make, we are all going to come at it from a different point of view. We are all going to bring our own things, our own attitudes, our own experiences to it. And in the process, as you say, Janice, we don't get to be the hero. We get to do our little bit. We add to the conversation. We support someone else who's doing some change work. We do a little bit ourselves. So yeah, so that they're really, really good words. I like that. Don't try to be the saviour. Oh, white saviour complex. Who'd have thought? Yeah, so thank you. Well, look, that's just right on 2 o'clock here in Melbourne. Thank you so much to Brooke and Neeti and Janice. I've actually been blown away by the quality of the conversation. I knew it was going to be good, but this has surpassed my own hopes. for this panel. And tell you what, it's set the bar really high for the next one that I do, because this is going to be the standard. So thank you again, and thank you to everybody else who has called in, you know, from across Australia and from New Zealand and the US. So lovely to be able to, by the power of technology that when I was a child belonged to Get Smart or science fiction, we're actually doing now. So little changes have brought us here. So thank you so much to everybody, and have a great rest of the day. Or I think, Emily, you're heading in tonight. So sleep well.
If you would like to learn more about what it means to be focusing on what women can do in the future and in the present to make progress rather than be stuck in the precedents of the past, make a time to talk with Bron. You can use this QR code or email her at info@bronwilliams.com.